Good morning, ASA. I'm Peter Caldas, CEO of Next 50 and the host of the Future is Old podcast. It's the podcast about the one thing we all become: old. And if you don't like that word, then this podcast is for you. And apparently, society really doesn't like us aging. Madonna was just at Coachella. Got to work in Madonna at an aging conference. And she was ostracized for dancing? What? There's a new New York Times guest essay that just came out yesterday, or maybe this morning, about the gerontocracy that we have to fight against. That's not terribly helpful, is it? And then finally, this podcast is actually a little bit about me. I'm turning 50 in August. And society thinks I'm done, I'm going to be irrelevant because of that number. Well, I have a few words for society. So, welcome to the Future's Old podcast. And every episode, we have a co-host. And you can download the first 2 episodes right now using the QR code. First episode features Ashton Applewhite. And the second episode is Ken Dykewald. And we have a whole slew of other guests, so please enjoy the first season as it comes out this year. But I said every episode has a guest co-host, and this one does as well. You know her, you love her. Please welcome the CEO of the ASA, Dr. Leanne Clark-Shirley.
I danced onto stage. Does that make me the Madonna of aging?
Yes, for sure.
Excellent.
By the way, so do those shoes.
Oh, yeah, well, you know.
Are you supporting the silver economy?
Good one.
I'm trying, right? I'm not a comedian.
That was a good one.
All right, so for all our listeners, really briefly, and for anyone actually who may have just come into a random conference room full of thousands of strangers, what is the ASA?
The American Society on Aging convenes the nation's largest multi-sector of professionals working with and on behalf of older adults. We're all driven by the mission that we should have a good long life on our own terms, and we're doing everything we can to make that true.
So why does it matter? Why should anyone be a part of the ASA?
Because everyone is aging. We're all aging. And the work that goes on in this association is some of the best kept magic in our country, and I'm going to do everything I can to lift the veil off that secret and make it more widely known.
That's great. One of the guests we had on the podcast is a gerontologist. You're a gerontologist too, but you're a special kind of gerontologist, if I remember. Kind of gerontologist?
The Madonna of gerontology.
You're the Madonna of gerontology.
I am a sociocultural and behavioral gerontologist. Did my training at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Focused on understanding the systems of care that we have, or as you heard Robert talk about, that we don't have in this country.
Your theme of this year's conference is belonging.
Yes.
Which is a great theme for what we are sort of feeling right now is sort of a lack of belonging. So I have a question for you. You're in a room of, almost 2,000 aging professionals on a belonging scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is, I know nobody, and my badge is turned backwards, to a 10, these are my people and I will never leave. Where's this room?
29.
All right, so next topic.
Okay.
What do the Olympics, Ebola, and Disney have in common?
Well, I sure wasn't prepared to answer that question. Can't say I've ever had those 3 things together in my mind, Peter. I do not know.
Well, they're all things that our next guests have done or dealt with. So, with that killer segue, let's introduce our guests of the Future is Old podcast. The CEO of Habitat for Humanity International, Jonathan Reckford. And the director of the Rosalynn Carter Mental Health and Caregiving Program, Dr. Neetu Abad. You know, since we're in Atlanta, we have some great Atlanta guests today. So, you're on a podcast, The Future is Old. It feels like as we age, we're constantly reminded that we don't belong because we're older. So, when was the last time each of you walked into a room and felt like you didn't belong? And what'd you do about it? Jonathan.
You know, I had one very long ago, but it was formative and really life-changing for me. After working my first job, which I didn't love, on Wall Street, I moved to South Korea in the mid-'80s to work for the Seoul Olympics and lived in the training camp with the Korean coaches and athletes, where I was the only non-Korean in the community for a year. And that taught me so much about being able to see my own culture, world perspective from a totally different perspective, and to know what it is to not be, you know, in a world where I'd grown up being in the dominant culture on almost every dimension, that was really powerful in reframing my view of the world.
Neetu, what about you?
Well, I'm a trained social psychologist, which means I've kind of trained to look at individual behavior and things on an individual level. And I chose to have a very long career in public health, surrounded by MDs and epidemiologists and folks from very different professions who looked at things in a very macro way. And so being somebody who was really interested in the individual and community and society, I always felt a little bit like the odd one out. They just sort of call us behavioral scientists. But over time, all of the different ways I've engaged with public health, the ability to understand the individual and how the individual lives in community, in society, is actually a superpower.
Indeed.
Let's talk a little bit about your bios, because I'm not sure everyone knows some of these details. Jonathan, you've had a bunch of really interesting jobs, including coaching the South Korea rowing Olympics team, the Marriott, Disney, Best Buy. Then you became executive pastor at a church. Was there a moment throughout that career trajectory where someone said to you, God, you're too old for a career change. What are you doing?
You know, I think seeing the closest I got to that was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, where some people said, hey, if you don't change now, it'll be too late. And my view was, that, you know, that's never how my career has been guided. For me, it was always a sense of where could I serve? And my favorite definition of vocation or calling, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for serving, but comes from theologian Frederick Buechner, who said, your vocation or calling is that place where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. Where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And you are all, I hope, finding the joy, that deep gladness of that intersection, even when it's hard. And for me, the business stuff was actually to learn the skills to bring to a nonprofit mission. And I think sometimes it's easier to see, looking back, how all the pieces fit together, even when I did some things that most people thought didn't make sense from a career perspective.
I mean, Neetu, you and I were chatting backstage, and you too see a through line through your career, which started with the Cook County Jail?
Yes. I was, I don't know, a very kind of a strange 19-year-old, and I wanted to really get involved in applied psychology. Where does the real world meet, you know, theory, understanding of trauma, resilience? And really, the Cook County Jail was the best training ground I could have ever had to understand how people's paths, context intersects with life trajectories, and then kind of, you know, for the various circumstances, lands one in the Cook County Jail system, in the incarceral system, the systems piece on the individual. And so I think throughout my career, I've kind of found myself at the center, the nexus of broken systems, people who are at their most vulnerable, who are struggling with wanting to trust institutions but not trusting them, not understanding the information that they're receiving on how to navigate those spaces. And as a psychologist, I think it was the shock of my life to know that knowledge and education doesn't always lead to behavior change. That it's people's experiences with institutions, their trust that they bring into a room, the lived experience that they have that's more powerful, I think, than any book you can read.
Great point.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I know, Leanne, you and I had a fondness for our grandparents. And Jonathan, I have to tell you, Jonathan's grandmother has a story. First of all, her name alone is amazing. Millicent Fenwick. Was she in Downton Abbey? Like, that is crazy. That is a great name. But she was a pipe-smoking congresswoman from New Jersey who Walter Cronkite called the conscience of Congress. Does Congress have a conscience anymore? She didn't start in politics until she was 64. Do you think if she was trying to run for office today, America would accept her? Would they tell her, go take care of your grandkids?
I think they actually would, maybe more than before. But she was a great role model for me because almost every time when I saw her when I was a child, she would quote her favorite Bible verse, Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And then she would say, what are you going to do to be useful? That was her view of the good life. We're supposed to be useful. And it took me a long time to go there. But she, one of the things I learned from her was she never saw politics for power. She saw politics because she had problems she wanted to solve. So she had co-chaired the civil rights campaign in the state of New Jersey before running for Congress. And she had a real passion for human and civil rights. And that led to the decision to go into Congress. And she also went into Congress with the belief that on any given day she'd rather quit than compromise on her ethics, which is different than compromising on legislation, but being tied to values. And she was a fierce fighter for both human and civil rights.
And Neetu, your grandfather was in politics in India, but wouldn't have been successful but for Kamal, his wife, and your grandmother of 10 kids who never learned to read or write, lived outside of Pune. Tell us about her influence on you.
Yeah, my grandparents are my heroes, and my mother comes from a very large family in India, and growing up, I would go to India and meet my grandfather, grandmother, and understand, how they lived in a multi-generational family, very embedded. Everyone was kind of involved in everyone's life, and it was a very colorful, very exciting place. And I was being raised in America. My sister, my brother, and I, by parents who had been raised in this environment. But over time, and it's really easy, I think, to maybe think about a very simple narrative. Oh, multi-generational families, aging looks very joyful, all of these things. But over time, I began to see how my mother and her, 6 sisters were the invisible workforce in that family, propping up. My grandmother was the head of that unit. My mother and the sisters were cooking for dozens of people who would come in unannounced, who were making the house a hospitable place to be, welcoming people. And their educational and career trajectories were heavily influenced by the choices that other people had made and the roles that they inherited. And then my sister and I, growing up, my brother, growing up in this country, were kind of, the doors were opening to careers, to education, to things that maybe my relatives didn't have access to. And, and aging can look very different here, and multi-generational families aren't necessarily the norm here. But there are kind of social costs to that as well. So I think that informed my very intersectional understanding of life, of gender, of expectations, of roles, and how that showed up in my family every day.
Wow, the power of grandmothers, I tell you.
I mean, seriously. I'm a 50-year-old man, and I'm still talking to my grandmother who's been gone 25 years.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
They created a sense of belonging at home, which I think is what I'm hearing from both of you. Jonathan, tell us a little bit about Habitat for Humanity's work, particularly through the lens of sort of an older adult at a build site. How are you creating belonging for them in building a home?
Well, I think, as you all know so well, we have a crisis of loneliness and lack of community. And Habitat has engaged millions and millions of volunteers, not really because that's the most efficient way to build homes, but because the center of our mission statement is bringing people together. And what we find is you can't create change without community. And, you know, I was drawn into the mission when I was working for Disney a million years ago, and Disney would spend a fortune on what I would call artificial team building. And, you know, one day I brought my whole team out, and we spent a day alongside a family putting siding on a house. And it was such a powerful experience of community that a number of us then became regular volunteers. And I think what's beautiful out on the build site is all those barriers. Desmond Tutu, another of my heroes, was the patron of our work in South Africa. And he had a quote I loved. He said, as the physical walls of the home go up, the invisible walls that separate us as people come tumbling down, and hope is built in the community. And I think there's something about literally serving together that changes the dynamics. You talked about head versus heart. There's something when you're serving together, you're focused on your shared values, not on what separates or differentiates you, whether that is age, whether it is all the other societal differences we have. And I've just seen fairly miraculous things happen around the world, whether that is, you know, we built the first mixed race community after apartheid in South Africa. When the Good Friday Accords were signed in Northern Ireland, Tony Blair and his team and Jerry Adams and his team spent a day building a Habitat home, and all the homes in Belfast were built by Protestants and Catholics building together. We've done that with Hindus and Muslims in India, with Christians and Muslims in Egypt. Yeah. We have even had Democrats and Republicans build together. So
wow.
Shows
anything's possible.
Really.
No, Jonathan, that's great. And I think as we think about the home then that gets built, Neetu, tell me a little bit about caregiving at home, because I suspect people lose their sense of belonging to the home when they're caregiving. I mean, for many, it feels like a work site sometimes.
Absolutely, it does. And I think, you know, we hear that from caregivers, that all of a sudden the home, where it's become this source of familiarity, comfort, choice of decor, choice of place, all of these things around choice become, you know, maybe without even an observable threshold, cross over, and it becomes a place where you're kind of, you know, you're in service. And parts of that service feel amazing, connection, purpose, meaning, and parts of it can feel daunting. You're, you know, spending your days trying to connect systems, trying to look out for somebody else, and the routines that you had and the familiarity and all of the pieces that make you you. You have to, you know, put that aside in order to have this kind of larger purpose. And so I think the caregiver identity in that space is incredibly important, both physically, but also emotionally, psychologically, and that's something our program is really interested in understanding, is how do you bring that sense of agency, sense of, you know, feeling good about your role, and bring, you know, and do the work at the systems level to make that easier on people.
Let's stay on that for a second.
Yeah.
2 months ago, my dad died of pancreatic cancer, and I was a caregiver for 2 months. And when I think about my own mental health and the fog of war, if you will, and how that slowly lifts, and it doesn't always, it gets you when you least expect it. I love that your center is marrying mental health and caregiving. Can you tell us a little bit about the merger and what that means to the work?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really been an incredible journey to walk into this role last summer, to be the director of the mental health and now the caregiver program, a merged program. Mergers are, you know, they can be bumpy. They can be, you're sort of having to figure out what your identity is after decades of Mrs. Carter's investment in mental health and investment in caregiving. But it has been such an enormous gift for us to understand that the mental health of caregivers is as important as any other facet of a caregiver's life. And it has allowed us to kind of sharpen our focus in this direction. not just on, so the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers was operating out of Americus, Georgia for 4 decades, and the mental health program has been operating for as long in Atlanta at the Carter Center. And so there's so many ways in which we can kind of leverage the history of what we've done for mental health and caregiving and put those together. So it looks like looking at programs and other resources to address the mental health of family caregivers. It has also given rise to understanding how individuals, caregivers caring for individuals with mental health conditions are a very important, kind of somewhere an invisible group, needing of kind of, special resources, more attention, more awareness about what those journeys look like as well. So, as we move forward, we're looking at leveraging our incredible history, our founders' legacy and philosophy, and putting these two topics more squarely together.
I want to stay on you, Neetu, because I'm fascinated by something you said to me backstage, which is during your time at the CDC, during COVID, you saw some crazy shit. And that was a quote.
Literally verbatim was what I think I said to you there.
But what I really want to hone in on is this topic we're sort of experiencing now, which is what happens when people lose faith in the institutions that are meant to support them. What did you see during that time, and what lessons can we draw from that?
Yeah, that I will be unpacking that experience of basically leading the vaccine confidence and demand team at CDC during COVID, probably for the rest of my life. In terms of that being, I thought Ebola was about as big as it was going to get. That was not true. A few years later, we were the entire world was going through this experience at once. And I think it was the fundamentals of trust that we all learned in real time. We thought, according to our data, what we know about older Americans and their trust in institutions and kind of their engagement in healthcare, it's usually higher. It's higher than it is for younger people, and that kind of holds today. And so we were sort of, I think, learned, and I think those of us who are sort of more behaviorally inclined, we're trying to urge people to see that when guidance changes, because it does, because it was a novel virus, because we were in a pandemic we'd never been in before, when guidance changes and folks have to change with it, their experiences and their trust in institutions is going to be the defining factor on how they move with you. And the ability for institutions to show up in a human way and to explain that we're learning also, that we're learning in real time and we're adjusting, and that our priority is the safety and well-being of everyone we're serving. So, we saw the trajectory of that, as guidance changed, as kind of trust started to really unravel, that manifested in individuals and communities that had been dealing with lockdowns and disconnection from each other. And I think we're all actually still unpacking that, what that really looks like for us. So trust, so fundamental to everything we do in public health, everything we do when we're serving communities. And I think all of us need to sort of unpack how that showed up in our life and how we can do better as servant leaders.
Yeah, Jonathan.
If I can build on that, I think it's institutions are easy to tear down and really hard to build. It takes a long time to create institutions, and we're in a global anti-institutional period. And I think the great danger in many ways is, I think on both edges of the political spectrum, people are assuming they can have all the benefits of strong institutions while they're tearing them down. History would say that's not a safe assumption at all. And I think we need to be very intentional about how do we strengthen, which includes reform, improvement, not status quo, but really thinking about how do we re-knit together the foundations of the core institutions that keep society working.
So we're going to go there, because it is the elephant in this room, which is federal funding cuts, the crisis that has impacted all our work this past year. And I wouldn't be doing my job as the CEO of a private foundation that supports the community-based organizations if I didn't ask you both to, without getting into the details, because truthfully, Bob Blancato is going to handle this tomorrow morning, but without getting into the policy wonky details, what are some when funding shrinks, in healthcare, in research, in mental health, what happens to that sense of belonging? Like who's the one who becomes invisible first when you start slashing like that?
Go ahead. I think underserved communities always kind of feel the brunt of that first, and the organizations who are trying to serve those communities and sustain their services. There's a shock period where, and I think all of us went through that, where we're seeing funding streams that have always been there, all of a sudden not there, literally overnight. And that's true globally, that's true domestically. I think one way in which, once that sort of shock kind of wore off a little bit and we could ground ourselves, is trying to be very creative around integration. And that's why I'm so happy to be able to talk with you about your housing work, because housing and mental health go together. Housing and caregiving go together. Globally, looking at ways to integrate some of our disease elimination and eradication platforms and look at mental health in the context of that, and caregiving in the context of that. So we have tried to pivot to be very nimble and trying to understand the opportunity, but there is also, grief. There's real grief.
Yeah, I would say I'm going to circle around, because the way we have designed our cities is actually a huge piece of the challenge to that. Because historically, cities were mixed income, mixed use by definition, because you had to be close to where you needed to work, and therefore people lived together. In the last 70 years, we've been becoming economically segregated. A lot of the conversation shows up in race and other difference, but the giant divide is actually socioeconomic. And I think one of the reasons the vulnerable are unseen is because people can live their lives fairly oblivious to what's going on in their same town, community, city. What's interesting in housing, and I've observed, is now there's great urgency in politics around housing. Even though it's been a crisis for the last 25 years, now that middle-class families, children cannot afford housing in the communities in which they grew up, it's become a political issue. And we already had a housing crisis, but it was invisible. People didn't see the people living in overcrowded conditions, paying half their income on housing, all the other challenges. And I do think the government cutbacks are just making it tougher. We were talking beforehand, if the effort had been reform, we would have been cheering. I think most of our major federal programs need reform. But just getting rid of the people who know how to make the bureaucracy work and then leaving the bureaucracy is kind of the worst of all worlds. And what we're seeing is, on the international side, less for Habitat directly, but devastating human cost to foreign aid pulling back, not just in the U.S., but in other wealthy countries as well. And I think here in the U.S., we're seeing the ripple of the K economy. Those with assets are doing great. Those without assets are absolutely struggling.
Can you give let me ask this question. Hold on. If caregivers and those in housing had the kind of lobbying power that banks and the oil industry do, what's the one change you'd think would happen tomorrow?
Well, first, I think that there is an identity that would emerge, that folks would understand that they're connected to a larger community of caregivers by virtue of being a caregiver. I think we know from our surveys that when you ask if someone's a caregiver, you get one number. If you ask about the duties of caregiving, you get a vastly different number. And so there is kind of I'm a mom, or I'm a sister, or I'm a daughter, I'm not, caregiving, what is that? So the identity to bring folks together and understand commonalities and different journeys, even though people can be very different, would be one kind of major thing that a lobby or that a collective effort would really do in that direction.
So build consensus.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I'll be critical of our own sector for a moment. I think one of the challenges in our sector is we are so small and fragmented. And so what happens is it's very hard to go with a unified voice because it breaks down so quickly. And the challenge is, housing people would say, well, housing's the issue, and if we just solve housing, that will fix everything. And health people say health, and you pick your education people would say education, and public safety people would say public safety. But all of that dilutes. And when I was in the private sector, fierce enemies would align together to influence Washington. And they were really sophisticated and really strong in that. And so I think we would carry more weight and we would do a better job, but it's really hard of getting together at the high level and not immediately subdividing and fighting with each other over the crumbs versus solving the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think that, I mean, I would argue, I think that is true, and I think it's not the fault of the people necessarily, but the systems that are designed to do exactly that and pit us against each other. And I feel like we need to hold on to that as we think about the future too.
I mean, on that note, I think if there was something that could rise out of this current circumstance, if we could find funding streams that talk to each other, that were braided at the top, that, when folks are trying to, they see housing needs in their community, but they also see significant mental health needs, or they, see the need to have better navigation and folks leading each other through systems. Can we make, funding streams tap into those various resources so that people can actually do that work on the ground? Yeah. I would love to see that kind of reform.
And to tie those together, I do think the way the budget system works against the best systems thinking. And what we've seen is, if you can think about ultimately outcomes for the families or for the end unit, rather than separating the different buckets. So for instance, health and housing is a huge intersection and on so many levels, and yet budgets don't usually work that way. So I was sharing with Peter, I was on a panel with the health minister from New Zealand a number of years ago, and he surprised me because he said the most important return on investment for health spending for New Zealand would actually be winterizing housing for vulnerable elderly, because we would save so much money treating tuberculosis and respiratory illness and other pieces. But their budget didn't work that way. And I think briefly in the Obama administration, when they started paying hospitals for outcomes instead of procedures, the hospitals started looking at their most expensive patients and realizing that if they didn't treat the mold in the apartment, they would consistently have a rotation of treating that patient in the hospital. But again, being able to think holistically about how we merge these, because healthy communities need all of the pieces. And I think the unnatural act is how do we align all those forces to create a community in which all those key factors come together.
And this past year has really, for me, exacerbated this idea that what we had wasn't great to begin with.
Right.
We were just tolerating these systems as being okay and normal. Mm-hmm. So in thinking about building what's next, we absolutely have to do more collaboration, which is really what I want to talk about next. You build houses, you care for the people in them. Have you all worked together?
We have, well, we share our most famous volunteer in our case.
Really?
Who's that?
For many years. So I think we view the Carter Center certainly as cousins through, because if those of you don't, most people actually think President Carter started Habitat for Humanity. That's actually not true. But what is true is when he got involved in 1984, riding a Trailways bus up from Plains, Georgia to New York City with Mrs. Carter, with the Secret Service trailing behind in a van. They spent a week sleeping in a church dormitory and rehabbing a building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And that's when the world really found out about Habitat and started a 35-year run of them building somewhere in the world every year. And so that was 1 week. They spent 51 weeks waging peace and fighting tropical diseases and doing all these other wonderful things. But I think there was the image of a former president out there with a hammer in hand and so committed to putting his faith into action in such a tangible way, and doing it for so long and so consistently was really the way the world found out about our work.
And it continues to this day. So next month we have the Carter Center staff who are going on a Habitat for Humanity build, and it was so popular they had to do a lottery to choose spots to see who would go. And I think that ethos of service and seeing, being a part of a community, seeing things as bigger than the self, than the individual, is something that unites the philosophies of our organizations together. And moving forward, there's going to be a lot of need and opportunity to collaborate, because social determinants of health, mental health, these things heavily go together. And when funding streams constrict and we become, looking for those kind of resources, we should bridge these gaps more.
Absolutely, and we're seeing aging in place has become a much larger piece of our work. So historically, we did primarily new construction, and that really led to a longer-term shift into thinking about how do we create holistic and healthy communities. And part of that then became preserving housing. How do we make sure that vulnerable seniors could safely stay in their homes? And we found, from a social cost perspective, relatively small modifications could play a huge difference. And I think another invisible group are often folks who own their homes but don't have enough income to be able to sustain them with rising property taxes and with all the other costs. But what we've seen is that relatively small modifications, starting with the simplest, whether it's ramps and grab bars and making the physical environment, opening up, widening doorways, and then simple critical home repairs, making sure that the house is dry, is safe, can make such a difference. And so we're seeing some really creative partnerships starting to happen between housing and health, and I think that's fantastic. We had a fascinating example in Nature magazine, peer-reviewed article, where for the last 4 years in Kenya, we showed that relatively small modifications in homes, and we're talking about $180, of screening windows, doors, eaves, and then putting reflective surfaces on the roof, lowered the indoor air temperature and reduced malaria-borne insects by 77%. Wow. That's a monster health outcome, but tied to housing. And I think that ability to think holistically. So one of my axioms is the only thing worse than partnering is not partnering. And partnering is slow and messy and hard, and there are extra grace-required people, and you've got to navigate it. But it's the only way we actually get to complex solutions, and that really has to be multi-sector.
I'm hearing to build what we need next, we need innovative policy thinking, collaboration, and now I think we need to talk a little bit about leadership, and not sort of the traditional notions of leadership, but I really want to dig in. Jonathan, you've been in this role now for almost 21 years this summer. I'm wondering, has anyone started that loud whisper of you're too old to be in this job anymore? We need fresh blood, new energy. Like, what has happened when experience has been so devalued? I'm curious to hear if you've had that happen to you.
It's maybe less in our space than I see in some private sector areas. There's a more active pushing out of experience. But I think there are balances. I certainly never want to be the last one to know it's time to go. But there's a trade-off that you all know so well. I think on our best days, there's accumulative wisdom, there's judgment, there's having lived through cycles, so you're not panicked because you've seen some of these things and both the ups and downs of the excitement of the up cycle and how to navigate the down cycles. And so I do think when we think about diversity, I think too often we go quickly to surface diversity, but diversity of thought turns out to be the biggest driver of better outcomes, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, government. And I think having a mix of perspectives and the wisdom, hopefully the accumulated wisdom of folks who have more life experience and organizational experience is incredibly valuable. So on the good days, hopefully we're still excited. And certainly if our role model is President Carter, I've got a long way to go.
Well, and Neetu, what I'm hearing is experience is a superpower, not a liability. How do you see that in your work?
Oh, I think I absolutely agree. Multi-generational workplaces have its challenges. They can be messy, but we can, sit together at a table and leverage the places we've been and the wisdom that we've earned and learned from our various experiences, down to the most junior staff to the most senior. Really having kind of an ability for more flat dialogue is incredibly important, and letting that junior staff know that their voice and what they're seeing with fresh eyes is welcomed by folks who have been at this for a while. I think, working in West Africa during the Ebola response, then during COVID, now working, at the center of mental health and caregiving systems, I used to be a little bit wary of my sort of out-of-the-box way of seeing the world. seeing connections that my professors in grad school would be like, but you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to run this experiment in this lab, and me being very interested in more community-based work and how this actually works in the real world. Going from Cook County Jail to, university academic setting, traversing those different grounds and being very comfortable and kind of almost a little bit of code switching, probably due to, growing up with bicultural identity. I used to be a little bit quiet about it. I used to be not wanting to bring that into the room. Now I know that can make the difference. You can see things when you see the world in that way that other people may take a little bit of time to understand how things are connected in that way. So when we were building Ebola treatment units in West Africa, and we were so confused why folks weren't willingly raising their hand and getting into ambulances. Well, it took the social scientists to say this community has never been into an ambulance, has never seen an ambulance come into their community. They don't have any context. We have to build that trust there. Understanding that mRNA vaccines, completely new to the whole world, scientists wondering why would folks not line up to get these? I mean, they did initially, but over time, why wouldn't everyone get this? Well, if you've never had an mRNA vaccine, if you've never understood that technology, seen it before, how are we doing our jobs to communicate the value of that to people? So to see the linkages and to step into the gray is where I think that is.
This has been an amazing conversation, and we're going to wrap it up, but I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to answer this really big question, and then we're going to turn to Leanne's questions. The first is, or the question is, imagine no budgets, no bureaucracy, you each have a magic wand. Tell me what your dream version of what belonging is for that 76-year-old woman on a Tuesday morning at home. What does it look like? Jonathan?
So I want to do a quick addendum there because I think you made such an important point about we need translators. And I would actually encourage all of you to think about we need more multilingual. And when I say that, we need people who can be bilingual, corporate and nonprofit. We need government to nonprofit, government to corporate.
Absolutely.
And actually that's where experience can be really helpful, where we've got folks who can build those bridges. I think my image for that woman is that she would live in a mixed income, mixed use, and intergenerational community where she is able to make a meaningful contribution and still use her gifts and skills to enrich the community and be in a community that includes green space, where she has access to full engagement and feels a valued member of her community.
That sounds like a utopia. Neetu? Yeah.
That does sound. I want that world. I think that person, he or she, would live where they want to live. So if that comes to, the home that they've grown up with, maybe with a daughter or a son who is there able to care for them, if it is outside the home in an institution or a living situation of their choice, there would be choice and there would be agency. And that caregiver and that, the family member who might be there to kind of be that support person would be as equally supported as the person that they're caring for, so that they don't have to choose between caring for themselves and caring for their loved ones. And that they would not only be seen as an essential part of that healthcare infrastructure, but as critical to that person's mental health journey as well, because they do play such an important role.
Yeah, these are worlds this room can help build, for sure. Leanne, close us out.
This building. Well, on the future of old, every episode ends with a few rapid-fire questions, and I have the true honor of firing them to you. Neetu, we'll start with you. What do you not miss about being younger?
Feeling unsure.
Feeling unsure. Jonathan?
I think not making all the mistakes of a young leader.
I can relate to that. All right, Jonathan, what is the gold in getting old?
I think on my best days, having some wisdom, some discernment, and some context to be able to give back and share to others.
Me too.
For me, it's being able to sit in the gray. I mean, literally gray, but also the ability to not have the answer right away and have that be okay.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right. Finish this sentence, Jonathan. I will know the future is old when
people are valued for their contribution, regardless of their physical age.
Neetu, how will you know that the future is old?
Yeah, I said this just a minute ago, but I'll say it again. When a caregiver or a caretaker does not have to choose between caring for themselves and caring for the person that they're caring for.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, Neetu, my co-host Leanne, thank you so much for joining us on The Future is Old.
Thank you, Peter.